Napoleon Bonaparte spent a night alone inside the Great Pyramid. This was 1798. He was 29 years old, already a legend, a man who had crossed the Alps, humiliated empires, and never, in the historical record, shown fear of anything. He went in alone. He asked to. He came out pale, shaken. His officers noticed immediately. Someone asked what had happened. He said, "Nothing. Don't ask me about it." For the rest of his life, through Waterloo, through exile, through everything, he never spoke about that night. Not once, not in his memoirs, not on his deathbed. Whatever he encountered in that chamber, in the dark, alone with 2.3 million stones pressing down from above, he took it with him. I've thought about that a long time, not because I believe in ghosts, but because Napoleon was not a man who scared easily. And whatever happened in that room was enough to silence one of the most verbal, documented, self-mythologizing figures in modern history. Something is in there. Maybe not what he felt, but something. And today, that's where we're going. Let's go back to the beginning, not the beginning of the pyramid, the beginning of the question. In 820 AD, more than 1,000 years after the pyramid was sealed, a man named Abdullah al-Ma'mun decided he was going to get inside. He was the Caliph of Baghdad, powerful, curious, the kind of man who believed knowledge was worth breaking walls for. And so he did, literally. His workers hammered through the limestone for weeks until they found a passage. They crawled through narrow tunnels in the dark, carrying torches, breathing dust that hadn't moved in centuries. They climbed upward, through what we now call the Grand Gallery, a corbelled hallway nearly 30 feet tall, with walls that lean inward like hands folded in prayer. They were looking for treasure, for gold, for the burial riches of a pharaoh. What they found was an empty room, the king's chamber, roughly 34 feet long, 17 feet wide, 19 feet tall. Walls made of red Aswan granite, quarried 500 miles away and somehow transported, somehow lifted, somehow set, with joints so tight you cannot slide a piece of paper between them. In the center of that room, a stone box, lidless, uninscribed, no carvings on the walls, no paintings, no hieroglyphics, no gold, no body, just silence, no name, no body, no explanation, just a box, the greatest tomb ever built, with nothing in it. That's either a tragedy or a clue, possibly both. Now, if you've ever been to a museum, and I imagine most of you have, you know what Egyptian tombs look like. They are crowded with meaning. Every inch of wall covered in painted scenes, in prayers, in the names of gods and kings. The Egyptians believed the afterlife needed instructions. They wrote them everywhere. Every tomb that was ever found, and thousands have been, has that writing. Except this one, the greatest structure ever built by human hands. The one that took more labor, more stone, more precision than anything else in the ancient world, and it has not a single hieroglyph inside. That's not an accident. That's a choice. And choices like that have reasons. Here's something else that sits quietly in the back of this story. When archaeologists and engineers began taking serious measurements of the pyramid in the 19th century, they started finding things that didn't belong in a world of copper tools and ox-drawn sleds. The base of the pyramid covers 13 acres. All four sides are equal to within inches, not feet inches, of each other. The corners are almost perfect right angles. The structure is level across its entire base to within just 2.1 centimeters. Now think about that for a moment. 2.1 centimeters across 13 acres of desert. Modern construction crews building skyscrapers in Chicago use laser levels, GPS systems, and decades of engineering education to achieve that kind of precision. And they're still proud of themselves when they get it right. The people who built the Great Pyramid had none of that, or at least, that's what the official story says. There's a particular kind of frustration that comes with getting older. Not the frustration of youth, which is loud and wants to burn things down. This one is quieter. It's the feeling you get when you've lived long enough to know that the first version of a story is rarely the true one. That official answers often paper over the questions that make powerful people uncomfortable. Most of you have lived through enough history to know exactly what I'm talking about. Wars explained one way in textbooks, another way by the people who were actually there. Decisions made in Washington, sold to the public as one thing, driven by something else entirely. You learn, after enough decades, to listen for what isn't being said. And when you listen to what isn't being said about the Great Pyramid, the silence gets very loud. There is no inscription saying this was built for Khufu. There is no record from his reign that mentions it. The only connection between the pyramid and the pharaoh Khufu comes from a single Greek historian named Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the pyramid was supposedly built. He never went inside. He recorded what he was told by Egyptian priests, who may have had every reason to simplify the story for a foreign visitor. That's the foundation of the official narrative. One man, 2,000 years later. Who wasn't there? I'm not saying Khufu didn't build it. Maybe he did. Maybe he commissioned the greatest engineering project in human history, and it was completed inside a single generation, and everything went exactly as the textbooks say. But I've been around long enough to know that when the evidence is this thin, and the questions are this thick, the real story is almost always somewhere in between. And the real story of the Great Pyramid is just beginning to surface. For most of the 20th century, the accepted answer to who built the pyramid was simple: slaves, thousands of them, driven by whips under a merciless Egyptian sun, forced to drag massive stones across the desert until the monument of a god-king was complete. It was a clean story. It fit the image people had of ancient Egypt: powerful rulers, oppressed masses, monuments built on suffering. Then, in 1990, a horse stumbled near the Giza plateau. A tourist's horse just south of the pyramids caught its hoof in a hole and broke through the surface of the desert floor. Workers came to investigate. What they found underneath was a cemetery. And inside that cemetery, bakeries, breweries, medical facilities and housing quarters, all organized, all built to support a large and sustained workforce. Over the next several years, an Egyptian archaeologist named Zahi Hawass excavated the site carefully. What emerged from the sand was not the story of slaves. It was something else entirely. The workers were Egyptians, skilled ones. They came in rotating crews of about 2,000 men, cycling in and out every few months from villages across the country. They were fed meat, beef, mutton, fish, at a scale that would have been extraordinary for common people of the time. Their bones showed signs of hard labor, yes, but also signs of medical care. Healed fractures, surgical amputations that the patient survived, teeth that had been treated. These were not disposable men. They were valued. They were taken care of. The ancient world, it turns out, had HR departments, just with less paperwork. And on some of the stones inside the pyramid, in places never meant to be seen by the public, hidden within relieving chambers above the king's chamber, there are graffiti marks left by the work gangs themselves. Crew names, scratched into the granite by men who wanted to be remembered. One of those crew names, roughly translated, reads, "Friends of Khufu." Now that changes things a little, doesn't it? Whatever the pyramid was, whatever purpose it truly served, the men who built it did so with something closer to pride than chains. That matters. Not because it makes the story more comfortable, but because it tells us something about how it was organized, about the kind of knowledge and social structure required to feed, house, rotate, and motivate a workforce of that size across 2 decades of construction. That's not improvisation. That's a civilization running at full capacity. And here is where the real mystery deepens, because the closer you look at that civilization, the more it seems like the pyramid was not the beginning of Egyptian knowledge. It looks more like the peak of something that had already been developing for a very long time. Think about that for a moment. Every technology we know of tends to improve over time. Early aircraft were fragile and limited. Later ones crossed oceans. Early computers filled entire rooms. Later ones fit in your pocket. That's the normal direction of things, rough, then refined. But when you look at Egyptian pyramids across history, you see the opposite pattern. The earliest pyramids, the ones built before Giza, are cruder, simpler. The step pyramid of Giza, the bent pyramid, which literally changes angle halfway up, as if the builders realized something was going wrong and had to correct course. These are the structures of people learning, experimenting, making mistakes. Then, suddenly, Giza. No gradual improvement, no series of nearly perfect pyramids leading up to it, just the most precise, large structure ever built in human history, appearing almost without warning, and then never truly equaled again. After Giza, Egyptian pyramids get smaller, cruder, more rushed, as if whatever knowledge produced the Great Pyramid was not passed down, or was deliberately held back, or came from somewhere that didn't last. That's a pattern worth sitting with. In 2017, an international team of scientists, physicists, archaeologists, engineers completed a 2-year project called Scan Pyramids. They used muon tomography, a technology adapted from particle physics that can see through solid rock the way an X-ray sees through skin. They pointed their instruments at the Great Pyramid and waited. What they found made headlines around the world: a hidden void, large, sitting above the Grand Gallery in a part of the pyramid that had never been excavated, never been mapped, never been explained, at least 100 feet long, possibly much larger, with no known entrance. We still don't know what's in it. Nobody does. The Egyptian government has allowed limited follow-up research. Some scientists believe it may be an architectural feature, a space left deliberately to reduce weight on the chambers below. Others think it may be a chamber, maybe a passage, maybe something that has no name yet because we've never seen one before. The pyramid, after 4,500 years, is still keeping secrets, and patient is not a strong enough word for what it is. There's a moment, if you've ever been outside on a clear night, far from city lights, somewhere quiet, when you look up and realize the sky is bigger than you remembered, that the stars aren't decoration, that they have positions, patterns, rhythms, that people have been reading them for as long as people have existed. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with the stars, not in the way we talk about horoscopes today. That's something else entirely. Their relationship with the sky was precise, mathematical. They built their entire civilization around celestial cycles, tracking the movements of stars and planets with an accuracy that modern astronomers still find impressive. And they built the Great Pyramid in conversation with the sky. Inside the pyramid, there are 4 narrow shafts, 2 from the king's chamber, 2 from the queen's chamber, that cut through the body of the structure at carefully calculated angles. For a long time, Egyptologists assumed they were ventilation shafts, practical, functional. Then, in 1964, an astronomer named Virginia Trimble ran the calculations. The shafts weren't pointing at random angles. They were aimed at specific stars, at the precise positions those stars occupied in the sky around 2500 BC. One shaft pointed toward Orion's belt, another toward Thuban, which was the North Star at that time, another toward the star Kochab, another toward Sirius, the brightest star in the Egyptian sky, the one whose annual rising marked the flooding of the Nile and the beginning of the Egyptian year. These weren't ventilation shafts, they were sightlines, windows into specific points in the celestial map. Now, to build shafts that precise, cutting through 200 feet of solid limestone at exact angles to hit stars that appear for only a fraction of each night, you don't just wing it. You have to know the sky deeply. You have to plan years, maybe decades in advance. You have to understand not just where a star is tonight, but where it will be when the building is finished. That's not primitive knowledge. That's a sophisticated astronomical science, and it connects to something that a researcher named Robert Bauval noticed in 1983. Something so simple and yet so striking that it's hard to shake once you've seen it. Look at the 3 pyramids of Giza from above. They're not in a straight line. The third and smallest pyramid, Menkaure, is offset slightly to the left. Egyptologists had always explained this as a practical decision, maybe a matter of terrain or available space. Bauval compared the layout to the 3 stars of Orion's belt. They match, not approximately, not in a general way. The relative sizes of the pyramids, their spacing, the slight offset of the third one, it mirrors the arrangement of those 3 stars with a precision that's difficult to attribute to coincidence. He called it the Orion correlation theory. It generated enormous debate. Some astronomers supported it, some rejected it. The argument is still ongoing. But here's what's harder to dismiss. The ancient Egyptians called Orion's belt the Sa, and they associated it directly with Osiris, the god of the dead and the afterlife. The Milky Way in their cosmology represented the Nile of the sky. The ground below was meant to reflect the heavens above. They were building a mirror, a map, a connection between this world and whatever they believed waited beyond it. And then there's the mathematics. I'll say this carefully, because numbers are easy to manipulate, and I'm not interested in manipulating you. The perimeter of the pyramid divided by twice its height produces a number very close to pi. The ratio of height to base approximates phi, the golden ratio, the proportion that appears in nautilus shells, in the spiral of galaxies, in the bone structure of the human hand. Now, you could call those coincidences. Here's the one that's harder to file away. The Great Pyramid sits at 29.9792458 degrees north latitude. The speed of light in a vacuum is 299,792,458 meters per second. Same digits, exact sequence. The meter wasn't formalized until 1799. The speed of light wasn't precisely measured until the late 1800s. The Egyptians had neither. I'm not telling you what that means. I'm not sure anyone can. But I've lived long enough to know the difference between a coincidence that sits quietly and one that keeps waking you up at 3 in the morning. This is the second kind. There's a particular state of mind that comes with age, not cynicism, but a kind of careful skepticism. You've seen enough official certainties crumble that you no longer need every question to have a clean answer. You can sit with the discomfort of not knowing. In fact, you've learned that the questions that can't be answered cleanly are usually the ones worth carrying. The Great Pyramid is one of those questions. Not because the truth is necessarily supernatural or mystical, but because the truth, whatever it actually is, seems to be bigger than what we've been given so far. And there's at least one more layer beneath all of this. It has to do with water. In 1991, a geologist named Robert Schoch flew to Egypt with one specific question, not about the pyramid, about the Sphinx. He wasn't an archaeologist. He didn't have a theory to prove. He had a tool, decades of training in reading stone, in understanding what different kinds of weather do to rock over time. And he wanted to apply it to something that had been bothering a small number of serious researchers for years. The erosion on the Sphinx didn't look right, not wrong in an obvious way, not wrong in a way that jumps out at you in a photograph, wrong in a technical way, the kind of wrong that only someone who has spent a career reading rock faces would catch. Schoch stood in the enclosure carved around the Sphinx, the trench of limestone that surrounds its body, and looked at the walls. And what he saw was vertical erosion, deep, rounded channels running downward like old scars, undulating, soft at the edges. Wind erosion doesn't do that. Wind is horizontal. It cuts in flat parallel layers like pages being turned slowly from the bottom. What Schoch was looking at was the signature of one specific thing. Rain, heavy rain, over a very long time. He went back to the United States and ran the calculations. The last time the Giza Plateau received that kind of sustained rainfall, the kind that would produce erosion patterns of that depth and shape, was between 7,000 and 10,500 years ago. The end of what geologists call the African humid period, a time when the Sahara was green, when rivers ran where there is now only sand, when the landscape around Giza looked nothing like what's there today. 7,000 years ago. Minimum. The Sphinx, according to Orthodox Egyptology, was built around 2500 BC. That's 4,500 years ago. You see the problem. If Schoch is right, and he presented his findings to the Geological Society of America, where the response from fellow geologists was largely supportive, then the Sphinx is not 4,500 years old. It's at least 7,000. Possibly 10,000, maybe older, which means it was already ancient when the pharaohs arrived, which means the Egyptians we know, the ones with the hieroglyphics and the papyrus and the elaborate burial rituals, may have inherited Giza rather than built it, may have found a monument already standing in the sand, already eroded, already old beyond their own memory, and said, "This is ours now." That's not a fringe idea delivered by someone selling DVDs at a conference. That's a credentialed geologist presenting peer-reviewed evidence to a room full of other credentialed geologists. The Egyptological establishment pushed back hard. They argued that wind-blown sand could produce similar erosion patterns, that the dating was unreliable, that Schoch was overreaching outside his field. He responded, calmly, methodically, that he wasn't making archaeological claims. He was reading rock, that's his field, and the rock said rain. The debate has never been resolved. Not officially, not publicly. And here's the part that stays with me. If the Sphinx is 10,000 years old, then whoever built it lived before writing, before pottery as we know it, before agriculture had fully spread across the ancient world, before anything we would comfortably call civilization. And yet they quarried limestone, they organized labor, they carved a monument 240 feet long and 66 feet high with enough precision that it's still standing. That changes the entire timeline of human capability. Not because it proves ancient aliens or lost continents or any of the dramatic narratives that tend to swallow this story whole, but because it means human beings were doing extraordinary things much earlier than our history books account for. And somewhere between then and now, that knowledge was lost, completely, without a trace, except for the trace carved into the rock, which is still there, which Schoch read correctly, which nobody in a position of institutional authority has been able to definitively disprove. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a fact like that. Not dramatic silence, the quiet kind, the kind that sits at the edge of everything you thought you understood and doesn't announce itself. It just waits. There's something that happens to knowledge over time. It doesn't always grow. Sometimes it shrinks. Sometimes it disappears so completely that later generations can't even imagine what was lost, because the loss itself leaves no trace. You can't grieve what you don't know is missing. We tend to think of history as a steady climb upward, primitive to advanced, ignorant to enlightened, each generation building on the last. And mostly that's true, but there are collapses. There are moments when everything accumulated over centuries simply stops. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example. We don't know exactly how much was stored there. Ancient estimates ranged from 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, works of mathematics, medicine, philosophy, astronomy, engineering, gathered from across the known world. Most of it is gone, not digitized, not translated, not safely archived somewhere. Gone, burned, scattered, lost to time and violence and simple neglect. We don't know what we lost there. That's the part that should keep us up at night. Now think about ancient Egypt across its full span, not just the pyramid-building era, but the entire 3,000-year civilization. 3,000 years. For context, the United States is 250 years old. Rome at its peak lasted about 500 years in the West. Egypt lasted 3,000 years, and then some. Over that stretch of time, knowledge rose and fell and rose again. Techniques were developed, forgotten, rediscovered, lost again. What the builders of Giza knew in 2500 BC may have been partially lost within a few centuries. Not because later Egyptians were less intelligent, but because knowledge without the right conditions is fragile. It requires infrastructure, stability, a system that values its preservation. And Egypt, like everything, had its periods of chaos. There's a specific era historians call the First Intermediate Period, roughly 2181 to 2055 BC, starting just a century or so after the Great Pyramid was completed. Egypt fractured. Central authority collapsed. Famine spread. The sophisticated administrative system that had organized tens of thousands of workers, fed them, rotated them, managed the logistics of moving millions of tons of stone, that system fell apart. No pyramid built after that period ever matched Giza, not in size, not in precision, not in the quality of the stone or the accuracy of the alignment. The knowledge to do what was done at Giza seems to have left with the stability that made it possible, and it never came back, not fully. That pattern in itself tells a story, because there's a specific kind of grief that comes with understanding what was lost. Not the dramatic grief of personal loss, nothing so immediate. More like the quiet ache of standing in the ruins of something magnificent and realizing that the people who built it are completely gone. Their names mostly, their methods largely, their reasons almost entirely. And here is the part that I think resonates with anyone who has lived long enough to see official narratives shift. In 2023, a team of researchers studying ancient papyri, the oldest known papyrus documents ever found in Egypt, discovered at a remote port called Wadi al-Jarf, translated records kept by a man named Mera, an overseer, a middle manager of the ancient world, keeping meticulous logs of his crew's work transporting limestone from Tura to Giza. He recorded daily. Loads moved, distances covered, men fed. It was bureaucratic and precise and deeply human, a man doing his job carefully, the same way people have always done careful work. Those papyri gave us the most direct written link we've ever had to the actual construction of the pyramid. Not a theory, not a Greek historian writing 2 millennia later, an actual contemporary record from an actual man who was there. And what those records showed was real and remarkable, a sophisticated logistical operation. Canals used to float stones, rotating crews, a system of organization so advanced it still impresses logistics engineers today. But here's the thing. Those papyri answered some questions. They confirmed the organizational capacity. They proved Egyptians were deeply involved in the construction. They didn't explain the precision. They didn't explain the shafts aimed at specific stars. They didn't explain the empty sarcophagus with no inscription. They didn't explain the void above the Grand Gallery. They didn't touch the erosion patterns on the Sphinx. The papyri told us who moved the stone. They didn't tell us who designed the thing, or why, or what knowledge guided the hands that placed each block within fractions of an inch. There's a version of this story that's entirely conventional, and it goes like this. Khufu commissioned a tomb. Skilled Egyptian workers built it using methods we haven't fully recovered. The precision is impressive but achievable. The empty chamber was robbed in antiquity, and all the mysteries have mundane explanations we simply haven't found yet. That version may be true, but there's another version, quieter and harder to hold, that goes like this. Something happened at Giza, something that drew on knowledge deeper than what we can account for, organized around purposes we haven't fully understood, and pointed at questions about human history that we've barely begun to ask honestly. That version may also be true. The honest answer is that we don't know. We have the object, we don't have the mind, and the desert doesn't volunteer information. Before we go any further, and there is further to go, I want to stop for just a moment, not to break the spell of this story, but because of something I've been thinking about as we've walked through all of this together. There's a reason you're still here, still watching, still listening. It's not just curiosity about Egypt or pyramids or ancient stones. It's something underneath that. The same thing that makes people your age, people who have already read enough books, already seen enough documentaries, already been told enough versions of history, still lean forward when a story starts asking real questions. You haven't stopped wondering. That's not a small thing. In a world that constantly tries to sell you easy answers, keeping the habit of genuine curiosity is an act of quiet resistance. This channel exists for exactly that. Not to tell you what to think, not to package history into tidy lessons with tidy conclusions, but to go deep, to sit inside the uncomfortable questions, to treat you like someone who can handle complexity because you can, because you've been handling it your whole life. If this kind of storytelling means something to you, if you've found yourself thinking differently about what you thought you already knew, I'd ask you to do one simple thing: subscribe, and come back tomorrow. Every day, we go somewhere. A battle, a civilization, a man or woman history nearly forgot. A moment that changed everything, or almost changed everything, or should have changed everything and somehow didn't. Stories told the way they deserve to be told, slowly, honestly, without shortcuts. It costs you nothing. It takes 3 seconds, and it means that the next time we sit down together like this, you'll be there. There's a word the ancient Egyptians used, Schoch, for the scribes who recorded history. The ones who sat in the shadow of great events and wrote everything down, not the kings, not the warriors. The ones who believed that the truth of a moment was worth preserving, even when the people in power would have preferred it forgotten. I think about those men sometimes, sitting cross-legged in the dust, reed pen in hand, trying to get it right. That's all any of us can do. Now. There's one last piece of this story that I've been holding back, deliberately, because it doesn't fit neatly into any of the frameworks we've discussed, not the orthodox version, not the alternative ones. It sits somewhere in between, and it asks something that I think will stay with you longer than anything else we've covered today. It has to do with a discovery made not in the pyramid itself, but beneath it. In recent years, ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Giza Plateau have revealed something that wasn't in any of the original archaeological surveys. A network of tunnels, chambers, passages running beneath the plateau at depths that suggest they predate the surface structures, or at least run independently of them. The Egyptian authorities have been cautious about these findings. Some have been confirmed, others remain under investigation. Access has been restricted, and that restriction in itself is a kind of answer, because governments and institutions don't restrict access to things that aren't significant. They don't post guards outside empty rooms. Ancient Egyptian texts, the ones that survived the Library of Alexandria, the ones stored in temples and translated over centuries, speak of a place called the Hall of Records. A chamber supposedly hidden beneath the Giza Plateau, where the accumulated knowledge of a civilization older than Egypt was preserved. Not mythology, written down, described in specific geographic terms. Herodotus mentioned it. The Roman geographer Strabo mentioned it. Various ancient writers from different cultures and different centuries referred to it as something real, a place that existed, that had been visited, that held something worth protecting. We have never found it, Or, and this is the question worth carrying, we haven't been allowed to find it yet, there are things buried in this desert that are still breathing, still waiting, still holding their silence with the patience of something that has already outlasted every civilization that tried to claim it. The pyramid was built to last. Every measurement, every alignment, every impossibly tight joint suggests a structure designed not for a single king's eternity, but for something longer, something meant to endure until the right question was finally asked. Maybe that time is getting close. Maybe it's already here. Here is what we know for certain. Somewhere around 2560 BC, in a desert that was already ancient, human beings, real ones, with names and families and tired muscles and thoughts we will never access, built something that has outlasted every empire, every language, every god that has ever been worshipped on this earth. The Greeks are gone, the Romans are gone, the Ottomans, the Byzantines, the Mongols, gone. Every civilization that looked at the pyramid and said we are the greatest thing that has ever existed, gone. The pyramid is still standing. That's not a metaphor, that's just what happened. And I think that's worth sitting with, not as a lesson about humility, because you don't need a lesson, but as a simple, quiet fact that changes the way you look at things if you let it. We spend a lot of time in the course of a life trying to figure out what lasts, what matters, what survives the wearing down of years. You learn, after enough time, that it's not usually what you expected. The things you fought hardest to preserve sometimes crumble anyway, and the things you almost forgot, a letter, a habit, a way of doing something small, sometimes those are the things that carry forward. The people who built the Great Pyramid understood something about time that we've mostly lost. They weren't building for their grandchildren. They weren't even building for their civilization. They were building for a scale of time so vast that it barely has a name, a span in which everything we call history is just a brief, flickering moment. And somehow, against all logic, against erosion and earthquake and looters and conquerors and the simple grinding weight of centuries, it worked. What they built is still here. Now think about what we don't know. The hidden void above the Grand Gallery, still sealed. The tunnels beneath the plateau, still restricted. The Hall of Records, if it exists, still silent. The true purpose of the shafts, the chambers, the empty sarcophagus, still open. Think about what was almost certainly lost. Knowledge that lived in the minds of specific people who died without passing it on. Techniques that required materials or conditions that no longer exist. Understanding of mathematics, astronomy, acoustics, stone. Understanding that may have taken thousands of years to develop and vanished in a generation. Think about the man named Mera, writing in his papyrus log by whatever light he had, carefully recording another day's work, another load of stone moved, another crew fed and rotated. He had no idea that 4,500 years later, someone would find his notebook and read it like a message in a bottle. He was just doing his job. He left a mark anyway. There's something in that, something I can't fully explain and won't try to. It has to do with the way ordinary human effort, done carefully and honestly, sometimes survives things that were supposed to outlast it. It has to do with the fact that history is not made only by the pharaohs, whose names are on the monuments, but by the overseers who kept the logs, the workers who scratched their crew name into a stone no one was meant to see. Friends of Khufu, they wanted to be remembered. And here we are, remembering them. The Great Pyramid will be standing when everything we've built is dust, when our satellites have fallen back to Earth, when our cities have gone the way of Memphis and Thebes and every other great city that once believed it was permanent. It will still be there, still keeping its angle, still aligned to north, still holding the void above the Grand Gallery like a secret it hasn't decided to share yet. If it could speak, and sometimes I think it almost can, I believe it would say something very simple, not about Egypt, not about kings or gods or the afterlife, just Be careful what you think you know. That's the only lesson worth carrying out of this desert. The rest, the answers, the explanations, the theories, those will keep changing. They always do. New instruments will find new chambers. New translations will correct old assumptions. New scientists will ask questions that make today's certainties look thin. But that one thing, the humility of knowing that the biggest structures in human history still hold secrets, that doesn't change. If this story moved something in you, even slightly, even just a small shift in how you see the ancient world, share it with 5 people. Not because it helps an algorithm, though it does, but because good conversations need more than one person. And the questions this pyramid asks are too interesting to sit with alone. Subscribe if you haven't. Come back tomorrow. There's more. There's always more. The desert is full of doors we haven't opened yet. Leave a comment below. Not about whether you believe the theories or not. That's not the point. Tell me what you felt when we got to the part that surprised you most. And if you have a place in history you've always wanted to go, a civilization, a person, a moment, tell me that too. That's where we'll go next.